Are you ready to rescue your cards? Today, I'm talking about some ink-related card making mistakes, plus one of the biggest crafty mistakes I think a lot of us make. Plus, my friend Ashani has a whole bunch of creative solutions for even more card making mistakes. So whatever's going wrong with your card making, I bet we can help. I'll put a link to Ashani's video at the end of my video, as well as in the description box below. Let's get started. Recently, I made a card with the Pinkfresh Studio Dainty Plaid layering stencil set, and someone mentioned to me that when they use it, ink gets under the stencil and it makes a smudgy mess. That certainly can be an issue with stencils with narrow lines or big open areas, because there's not a lot of anchoring down the stripes. Like any smudges on any card, I'm not sure there's really a fix, but you can use a distraction technique. You can cut the panel down to get rid of the smudges, or you can splatter it, or you can cover up the smudges with a sentiment strip or embellishment. Smudges, bad stamping, crooked stamping, there's so many places that it's easy to go wrong while we're creating. And in this case, maybe it's more about figuring out how to prevent it. Let's see how that looks. First, I gave it a try with my new Altenew sticky mat, which I think is my favorite part of the Altenew stamp wheel. I've been using it quite a bit since I got it a couple of weeks ago. And by the way, the sticky mat is being sold separately on the Altenew site. These stencils are designed to create a pattern that exactly fits an A2 card, so there's not a lot of extra stencil material around the panel like there would be if they were 6 by 6 inches. I can see that the stencil is not lying flat against the cardstock. You could use pixie spray or another temporary adhesive, but I find that it can leave a sticky residue on the cardstock, which could be a problem when I try to fill in the plaid with my other colors. So first, I'm just trying this one-handed to see how it goes. The solid portions of this layer are pretty thick, so I'm not expecting too much trouble. And yes, I got a pretty crisp impression, even one-handed. And I had no trouble with the stencil itself shifting, even though there wasn't a lot of it holding on to the sticky mat. I'm happy about that. On my second layer, the solid portions of the stencil are a little narrower, and that can make them a little less stable and prone to shifting as I use my brushes over top. Again, I'm going one-handed, and it seems to be going pretty smoothly. A couple of times I could feel the stencil jump a bit, but in the end, the result seems to still be okay. Layer 3 and color 3, and we're back to pretty narrow open areas, which means those thick solid areas are pretty stable. And I'm thinking maybe this sticky mat is just that good. Now, the genius of this layering stencil set is also the thing I like the least about it. To create the plaid, you just clean the stencil, flip it over, and fill it in the other way. I love the ease of the design and the efficiency of having only 3 stencils, but I do not enjoy getting up to clean stencils in the middle of creating. My dream craft room has a sink in it, but my real one doesn't, so it's a trip to the kitchen each time. I'll continue this in a moment, but I just put my yellow blending brush into my pink ink. Now what do I do? If there's not a ton of ink on the brush, I just blend it off onto a scrap piece of paper or a cloth until it goes back to the regular lighter color. Then I'm good to go. But what if you get a lot of dark ink on your light brush? I've done this on purpose here to show you, but it has happened to me for real a few times when I'm not really paying attention while I'm ink blending. So the first step is to blend as much of the dark ink off the brush as you can, just like I did earlier. This obviously isn't going to come clean as easily as the pink ink, so back down to the kitchen we go. One of the things I love about these brushes is how easy they are to clean. Watch how the ink just runs out of the bristles, and I gave it a scrub on my hand to really get it running clear. Then I grabbed a tea towel and I blended the brush on it. This is really to get as much of the excess water out as possible. Now I can't use this brush again today. I find it takes about a full day to dry completely. But here it is the next day, all dried and looking ready to go, straight back into my yellow ink. To finish my panel today, I grabbed a blending brush in a slightly darker color, and I'll just use that for now. This time I felt the stencil jumping a bit more as I was blending, so I have a couple of suggestions for that. First, use your other hand to hold down the 2 pieces of the stencil on either side of the area you're blending, while you blend in small areas. Second, as you're putting down the stencil, try putting it down in one corner, then almost pulling it tight as you move to the opposite corner to try and limit the space between the stencil and the paper. Obviously, there's a limit to how much you can really stretch a stencil, but I'm sure you get what I mean. And then, oops, I dumped my dark blending brush into my yellow ink. Now I've got yellow ink on my aqua brush and a big spot of aqua on my yellow ink pad. Start by trying to clean the ink pad itself, and try to do that as soon as possible. I've got a baby wipe here and I'm just kind of dabbing up that Aquatini ink with it. You can see that I'm also pulling up a ton of yellow ink, which will leave that area of the ink pad dry and needing to be refilled. And that leads me to another mistake you can make if you love to stamp, and that's to not have the ink refills for at least your most used ink pads. I remember when I started stamping, I resisted the idea of refills. I thought I would much rather have more colors than have the refills, and initially, that's not a bad thought. But over time, I developed a love for ink blending, and that meant I was using more ink than when I was just stamping, and I started collecting refills as my ink pads got dry. Even then, I resisted the idea of using my inks to color cardstock, until I realized that I was using a ton of space and a ton of time storing and finding my colored cardstock and all the scraps. Now I keep only white scraps, and I color them with my ink pads when I need them, and I know they'll all match with any stamping or backgrounds I've already done on my cards. After refilling, my pad is good as new and ready to go. Yes, there's still a bit of yellow ink on the brush, but it'll likely blend out very quickly, and if not, I can just take another trip to the kitchen. Back to my panel and my final color. I like it like this, so I'm not going to do the third layer on this side, and that's one of the great things about this stencil design. Any combination of these 3 stencils is going to give you a really neat and different look. When removing the cardstock from the sticky mat, I just pulled it off, and it wasn't damaged at all, but I did get quite a bit of warping this time, although it did flatten out pretty easily. I'm going to come back to this with a solution in a few minutes. So I didn't have much trouble getting ink under my stencils, and I wondered if maybe it was because of my grip. So I thought I'd try it again with no grip, just tape. I've got 2 pieces of tape holding my cardstock to my stencil, and my stencil's dirty just because I didn't want to go back downstairs to clean it. Right away, I'm feeling more movement in the stencil, and whoops, there, I caught the top corner of the stencil and I lifted it, and I did create a little smudge up there in the top corner. The nice thing with this set is that it's designed so that if you use all 3 stencils, you'll be filling in the whole panel. So if you do get little smudges, you won't be smudging into white space. It'll be less visible. This time I'm adding a bit more tape to hold the stencil down to my glass mat. I'm still needing to hold on to the stencil itself, but remember this layer is the floppiest layer, even with the sticky mat. My stencil for the yellow layer is also dirty, and this time I'm putting my extra tape into the corners, so hopefully I won't be lifting them with the brush. Another thing to remember when blending onto a slick surface like a glass mat is that there's probably active ink sitting off the edges that may contaminate both your brush and your panel. Other than that though, this configuration with tape on the corners seems to be working pretty well. Another technique to try when blending is to go with a light hand and layer up your color by going back over the areas a few times, rather than trying to get a heavy coating of ink all down at once. Okay, I'm not going to finish the plaid because I don't want to clean the stencils, but I will try one more stencil grip, my waffle flower stencil mat. First, I love the corner on this. It makes it so easy to replace anything you need to replace in the exact same spot. And I've been using bigger cardstock, the same size as my stencil, so that I can hold both the stencil and the cardstock as I'm blending. The nice thing for this mat is that you don't need tape. In fact, tape won't stick to the silicone, so you do need to use your other hand. That can lead to ink on your hands, so be careful about transferring that. But really, by using that other hand to almost push the stencil and paper into the corner and occasionally pushing down onto the area of the stencil I was blending, again, I didn't have any major problems with ink getting under the lines. So that got me thinking about why some people are having problems with this stencil, and I can't even seem to really recreate them. Earlier, when I realized it could be the grip I was using, I showed you some options. And then I started thinking it could also be the blending tools. I don't have other blending tools, but I do want to say that first, I think bristles have more flexibility than foam when working with a stencil. I'm not sure if that means it would be more or less likely to get under the stencil, but I think as the bristles come up to the edges of the stencil, they may have more ability to bend away rather than pushing on the edges. And these brushes have a perfectly flat bristle surface, which may also make a difference. I've noticed when I've tried these little angled detail brushes, they really do get under a stencil, any stencil, so I think that could be a factor. I don't have any other ink pads to try, but generally foam ink pads like the ones I'm using can be pretty juicy, so I would think they would be the ones to most likely have this kind of problem. I went to my Evernote inventory and I looked for the floppiest stencil I could find, and I think this striped stencil from Birch Press Design probably fits the bill. Each stripe is anchored only by a very narrow piece of plastic on either end, so structurally there is nothing in the center to stabilize it. It's similar to the Dainty Plaid, but I think even more prone to movement. I'm back to my Altenew sticky mat, but I think a Cricut type mat would give similar results. I'm wondering how well the sides of this stencil will stick since they're very open. I'm feeling the stencil moving as I start blending, so I did use my right hand to help hold the stripes in place as I blended, almost pulling them toward the right-hand side so they're tight against the cardstock. And I think that's my best advice for working with stencils like this, with big floppy open areas. Okay, now this time to remove the cardstock panel, I did what I've been doing with my plastic sticky mats, which is trying to bend the mat back away from the cardstock, and this time I did get a lot less warping. Although even last time, it was easy to bend it back to flatten it out, so I would say warping's not a big issue with this mat. As for the staining on the mat, I've been cleaning it with Ultra Clean, and that's getting most of it off, but the pink really does stain it a bit. That's not something that bothers me a lot, but I know it's a factor for some people. As I was finishing these cards, I noticed something that happens quite a bit that isn't really a mistake. It's more of a little annoyance. The design of some dies ends up leaving indents on your cardstock when they've been cut. This can be the die design itself, including those little holes that you can use to poke the die cut out of the die. Or it could be how tight your cutting sandwich is in your machine. And for me at least, I notice it more on my metallic cardstock than on regular white. Maybe it's thicker or the reflection on the surface makes any flaws more noticeable. With a shadow die, you could probably get away with just adding the top layer to cover up the bumps, but I think there's a better way. Fixing this is as easy as just running the die cut through your machine again, this time just in the sandwich, no die. The pressure will flatten it out so it's a lot less noticeable. I finished these cards by cutting down the panels quite a bit. Whenever I have an intense color palette, I find adding lots of white helps to balance it out a bit. I added some gold gems from Crafty Meraki, and that's it. So now finally, what is the biggest mistake that crafters make? I think it's not having an organized space. Whether you have a dedicated craft room or you're someone who uses the dining table and has to put all your stuff away every time you craft. I'm not here to tell you exactly how to organize your craft space. We all need things that work for us and the way we craft. But there's no doubt that knowing what you have and where it is will save you time and money and allow you to focus on what you love, creating. That's why the upcoming Paper Crafters Get Organized Summit is such a great idea. There's 27 different presenters who are all unique and all organized different from each other, so I'm sure there's something here for everyone. From very specific ideas for storing very specific supplies to more general organizing philosophy ideas, we've got you covered. And you can attend for free. I've put a link below in the description so you can register for your free ticket. And now be sure to get even more ideas for fixing card making mistakes that happen to all of us by heading to this video on Ishani's channel. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.